a few years trip around the country, and I photographed many places in the desert, mountains, some small places or hidden near the ocean, and later we featured it in the magazine. In 2013, I was on my usual press trip to Dhofar. I remember I convinced my boss to send me for a few days to Salalah and the places around, just to collect the stories for the magazine, because our office was in Muscat, so the Salalah is over 1,000 kilometers. It wasn't very easy to, or very quick to go there and collect photographs, stories, or interviewing anyone. So I went to Dhofar, and I was thinking about some places just to collect a story for magazine, nothing unusual. And I found something what I can say here today changed my life a bit. I will show you what I found there. I will make maybe screen of my yes. I found there something what was later my PhD on the National Film School. Kamala mentioned it a few minutes before. I found abandoned places, a lot of abandoned places in Oman, mostly located in Dhofar, Mirbat, a few Salalah, a few places in Salalah, and I remember a few houses I photographed in small town called Taga, and later I did some research in the mountains behind Nizwa. Today I will show you the project of the book. I'm working on it now. I decided to show the final project, or the process of the final project, not some special presentations. And this is what I can show you today. Most of my photographs. Oh, sorry, there's something wrong with. Do you see this? I will show you the photographs I took mostly in the interior of these houses, because I found there something what I call it, hidden culture or traditional Omani culture, which I didn't see too much as a press photographer living in Muscat. I found places which look like, some scene of the historical films, or some places which remind me old photographs. I tried to find out why these houses are abandoned, and why, for example, Mirbat, the old town in Mirbat, is completely abandoned. Maybe a few places is still inhabited. And the Omani people told me that they left these places because during the economical growth, they got the money from the government to build modern houses and modern residences. So they left the traditional houses, and they living just in the same places, but a few 100 meters sometimes I saw new villas, or some much more modern houses. So I took a lot of photographs there. 2 years I spent traveling from Muscat to Mirbat, collecting photographs. I used traditional medium format camera and color reversal film to get this also specific kind of color and mood I noticed there. So this is photographs I put to the book now. For example, the overviews of the Mirbat. If someone would like to add something or see something specific on the photographs, I will be very happy to get it, because I'm looking for someone who could, contribute to this book and add some text about this specific or this particular places. This is how it looked like when I came there first time. Ruined and demolished houses with some elements of traditional culture, like this wooden doors, or some elements inside, like this frame of the wooden bed inside of the on some room. The book, the houses outside look very, very not attractive. Brownish or some reddish color sometimes, without any specific color or anything. What I found inside actually. These two photographs I took in Salalah, in Al Hafa, which was completely demolished on the beginning 2015. I remember I came to Salalah to get some photographs, and I found this entire complex of the buildings were razor to the ground. Inside of the houses in Mirbat, when I captured a lot of photographs, I think I could do a book only about the Mirbat, but I decided to show all places I found in Oman years ago. Nobody was there. People told me a lot of stories about the age of these buildings. Most of them remember the times before Sultan Qaboos, came to the throne in Oman and started this, rapid changes in Oman. These two photographs are important for me. These pictures on the right side show the old wardrobe with full of clothes. The clothes were still there, and I found this place like this. Look like the people left their places even without collecting all their belongings. On the left side is something funny. In one of the building in Mirbat, I found a picture of Mona Lisa inside. Exactly, it was disposed like this. I took a few photographs, 2 frames, and later tried to put this painting on the wall. Don't know what's happened later. Some elements I found was exactly from the middle of 19th or beginning of 19th, what let me know how long these buildings are abandoned and demolished. These pictures on the left side is this yellow door. This is the third version of this picture. I tried to get this specific light, which I noticed inside of these ruins. And after 6 months, finally I came to Muscat, to Mirbat, and could take this photograph with this light. It was very, very difficult sometimes to taking photograph inside because of darkness and very low level of light. Some places look like archaeological sites, very modern, but archaeological site with a lot of elements of the culture or small items the people left in this building. I'm not sure my feelings are correct, but I had the impression that some people just left these houses, went to some modern places, but still used these old places like storage place, or some I don't know, a place for guests, or I saw the Omani guy who gave this old house to the some workers from India or Bangladesh who were working for him as a fisherman. So it wasn't like they left these places forever, but many years, I think the old houses were still used for some additional situations. So, this two photographs I took in Birkat Al-Mous, so the place much closer to Muscat. This mud bricks building are less colorful or abandoned area, I think, than the places in Dhofar. Some items I found there. I focused on the light and color because my aim was to get some artistic project or very subjective project with, of course, documentary elements or documentary features, but it wasn't a scientific project. I mean that I documented every single room and collect some story from the owners. I tried to find the owners of this place, but it wasn't easy, and many of buildings I even don't know was owned by whom, or maybe these people do not live anymore. But in some building, mostly in Bakhla, Hamra, and few houses in Mirbat, I found the owners. Of course, the final set is not ready yet, is far away from the final book, but I choose around 100 photographs to the final projects, and all these photographs are here. For example, these photographs on the left, I try to check how old is this place and how old is this wooden frame of the bed. And I remember that this material you can see here, when you touch it, you immediately, change to the dust in your hand. Very old. Some photographs I took in 2018 during my last visiting in Mirbat, like these pictures on the left side. Color and light was my main object there. So I tried to combine two things in my, let's say, career. I'm an archaeologist by education and photographer by profession and passion. So I try to combine this archaeological kind of thinking and photography, what was helpful to achieve the doctorate in National Film School in Łódź 4 years ago. "99% photographs I captured inside of this building. There is only a few photographs taken on the streets. I documented this also because I think the projects like this are much more important after years than in the moment when these photographs were taken. There is the pictures. This green photograph is only one photograph I took in Muscat. in the small place called Kalbuch, I found 2 abandoned houses, and I took these photographs. Rest of them mostly are taken in Mirbat and mountains behind Nizwa. Most of photographs I needed, for most of photographs I needed long exposure. So there is almost 1 minute exposure for all photograph taken in this darker interiors. Later, I had to collect all these films and develop it here in Poland. Check these photographs, and if some images needed to be, taken again, I drove to Mirbat and trying to take these pictures again. Also 2 photographs from Wadi Bani Habib, abandoned place in Jebel Al-Akhdar, very popular destination for some weekend trip or tourist trip or hiking. I found these pictures of His Majesty, and I think the pages from Holy Quran in some empty room. Pictures on the left is taken also in Wadi Bani Habib. This is a small mosque in the village on the top of the mountain there, and a photograph on the right side is abandoned place in Al-Hafa in Salalah. So sometimes I mix the places or locations just to achieve some visual effect, and I'm not I don't think doing any project like places documentary every places, Salalah first, Mirbat, other places, without mixing these photographs makes sense for me. Also how it looked like before demolishing. This hotel in Mirbat is still there, I think, but this house on the right side is completely destroyed, and now there is some beach with palms in Salalah in this place now. I found also places and moment when the building were completely demolished. It was beginning of 2015. They started clean up this place. I asked people why this building are destroyed. So they told me there is some plan to create some heritage village here and place for attractive for tourists and visitors, and that's why they decide to destroy all this part of Salalah. So now in Al-Hafa we can see beautiful white sand beach with palm trees, and this is how it looked like on January 2015 when they started this cleaning process. And this is everything. Thank you very much. What I can quickly say about this this place now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerzy. That was really interesting. There was quite an active chat going, and I'm sure we have some questions.
Yeah, please.
So everyone should ask their questions. I think you can. John might have raised his hand first.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Just to let me get my video going. Just to ask the same question that I put in the chat. I know in Lebanon, if you go to some of the villages there, then the old houses are all falling down. And I asked one of my friends there why that was the case. And he told me that there was a big diaspora, that people had left the country and gone off to other places. And then the people who stayed behind, when they wanted to renovate the houses, they didn't want to put their money in, because if they did that, then the family members who had left would still have an ownership of that house. So they would then be effectively be giving money to the other family members, and the other family members didn't want to invest in the house because they'd got their own houses in the US or whatever. So I just wondered if that was a similar situation in Oman. Also, just to add, these old houses are so much more comfortable to live in than the new houses. I stayed for a while in Tunisia in the old souk, and the old house I was living in was just so cool compared to some of the more modern hotels.
I found some houses with people, so I was knocking to the door to find out who is living there. But most of the people I met in Mirbat, for example, come from Bangladesh. So asking, are you living here or you are own of this place? No, there is still a Omani guy who owns this house. He's living somewhere in the new part of the city, but we are just fishermen and working on his boat, and we're living here. So in 2018, when I was there last time, I saw the new constructions very close to these ruins. So I'm not sure what is there now. Maybe someone who was in Oman, who is in Oman, can tell me. But it looked like local government or the owners, whoever, decide to clean up this place and just build some new houses, very similar to other houses we can find in all GCC countries. It's same like they did in Al Hafa. So when I was in Al Hafa, I had even problems to recognize the place or to find some my position or locate myself in there, because I was looks completely different. So they completely destroyed the houses, and the entire place looked like a completely different place. So Omani people, same in Muscat. I spoke with friends in our office in Subcomedia, for example. He said, no, if we have an opportunity to build something new, something more modern, so why do not do it? And there wasn't too much popular thinking that this is our heritage, or we can use this wooden part of, I don't know, doors or windows to create some even artwork. It was like I had the impression that this kind of thinking is not, let me say, popular, yeah, and it's better to buy something new, even expensive, than create something arty from the handcrafted or handmade things. So maybe a few buildings in Mirbat will survive, because in 18 I saw some 2 or 3 places, exactly 3 places renovated, but rest of them I think will be looks like Al Hafa or in place in Taga.
Are there other questions? I think let's self-elect. Matt Minchell looks like he's raising his hand. I'm sorry, you're muted. We can't hear you.
I beg your pardon. Is that better?
Yes.
I'm so sorry. Jerzy, that was absolutely fascinating. The photographs are deeply stunning, and your thoughts are really insightful. Coming from I totally agree with all of the thoughts, and perhaps there might be some that we can reflect from our own history. In the UK, for example, as industrial development happened, there was a huge move towards the cities, and a lot of the old houses were just small houses were abandoned and have disappeared completely. If you look in England, there are old stone churches in the middle of nowhere. And the reason was that they would have been surrounded by wooden houses, which have simply disappeared into dust. Mirbat I've known for 35 years, and it has changed dramatically. There was, of course, there was a big conflict area there during the Dhofar War in the 70s. But it's possible that people have just, Omanis are becoming more wealthy. They've moved into the cities, as your other fisherman friend said. And I said to one Omani, I said, why can't you keep it as it was? And he said, we're not keeping the old stuff just for your morbid nostalgia. We have to move on. We have to develop everything else. And I suspect my personal view is that this is a natural progression. And then as it becomes trendy again, exactly the same in the UK, people will move back into the country, buy all the old houses, and the prices will go up. Anyway, it's just a thought. And thank you so much for something which is really wonderful, and I hope the book is a great success.
Yeah, thank you. Let me add something. In Mirbat is a museum located in the castle, very close to the shoreline. When I was there, I found some artifacts or some museum objects look like prepared especially for this exhibition. But literally, the house next to the castle, I found original paintings look very, very similar to these objects in the museum, in completely, decaying, decaying process, when I asked the guy from the museum that the original objects are just for free, you just go there. No. We got this from some department of heritage and culture ministry, and this is what we can show to the visitors or the tourists. So I thought that he even didn't understood what I wanted to tell him, that the original objects are spread around the city. So there is no reason to engage any people to create the new or original looks objects. And I had many times I had the same conversation and the same feelings that in Oman, people want to forget about their past, and they absolutely, face to the future and progression. Yes, as you said, exactly the same. Thanks.
If there's no other questions, I mean, I have one comment, which is, I think we should be a little careful in attributing attributing a kind of intent to abandon the past and to move on to the future to like sort of the Omani people in a general sense, especially when, and the point that John raises quite well is that a lot of times when areas are abandoned, it has to do with changes or complications in ownership or people's ability to plan for the future. And I mean, you hear rumors, which I don't know, maybe people who are more plugged into the, like who are living in Oman, who are Omani in the Dhofar area than me, have a different, get those rumors in with more and less veracity than I do. But for example, you hear rumors about that part of Mirbat for since I started going to Oman, so almost 10 years ago, that area is supposed to be a Marriott. And then a few years ago, you hear a rumor that it's going to be both a Marriott and a US naval base. Who knows if that's anything. I've heard that from multiple people, right? So the kind of like, there's been a cycle of possible plans. I'm sure at some point, for example, in the mountains of Oman, I'm not sure about that part of Oman. I don't know how ownership is handled. It seems like people own and can buy and sell that land. but it's possible that areas that are like targeted for heritage or targeted for development are people are allowed tenancy, but they don't own. And I wonder if the coastline is like that. I know some of the areas around Mirbat are actually designated for purchase from foreigners. Other areas in Mirbat and in like urban Salalah or urbanizing Salalah, like there's land that can be given from the government to people and then bought and sold. It can be bought and sold from private citizens. The mountains, for example, are all people are given tenancy contracts, but they are not owners. So none of the land in the mountains can be bought and sold. And I think that starts with the rise of the escarpment. So like what's called the Gerbeib. So the whole seaplain can be bought and sold, but the mountains can't be bought and sold. And this is, part of the heritage of the revolutionary period, right? Part of the heritage of the 70s. And I think probably something similar exists in the mountains near Nizwa, just knowing the history up there, knowing less about the specifics. So, I mean, these are kind of things that really constrain the ways that people can plan what to do with their land and where they live and where they end up moving. And so, I mean, these are important considerations to have as well. It's not just a sort of narrative about, people's ability to have, desire, pressure to modernize, or ability to tolerate a kind of cosmopolitan, nostalgic, connection to their heritage. And I just wanted to only raise this comment just to avoid sort of the like attribution of intent or of blaming or something like that of losing heritage, because that is a kind of narrative that you hear in other places where they're like, oh, these people are not so concerned about preservation. And there are individual efforts at preservation against which that run up against the sort of pressure from the state in Oman as well, which is sort of heritage presentation and heritage preservation is controlled in Oman in ways that it's not in, for example, in other places, or just in different ways. So the state exerts, as you were just pointing out in your answer to the other question, really exerts a lot of pressure there. And so these are important factors to just keep in mind, I think. I just wanted to raise that. Thank you so much for these absolutely beautiful photos. Having been to a number of those places and seen these houses crumbling, I mean, it's, I never had the nerve to go inside the houses at Mirbat, but I always wanted to. I was afraid they would fall on me. But so thank you so much for sharing these wonderful images.
Thank you very much, too.
I don't know, are there final comments? Oh yeah, it seems Marielle wanted to make a comment. Marielle, would you like to speak up? I don't see you.
Hey, sorry, you're gonna hear cats because they're around. I just wanted to say two comments. First of all, even now, it's very normal, and I'm not exactly sure of all the ramifications of it. When you move to a new house or buy a new house, you leave all the old things behind. And you either give them away to family or you simply leave them in the house. But that when you buy a new house, I mean, my Dofari friends now, it's so expensive because you have to build the house and you have to buy every single thing new. The beds, the sofas, the washing machine. So it makes sense to me that the old houses would have all of these things in them, because that's still how moving into a new house is viewed. And the second thing about Mirbat is there was a Marriott, which didn't make any money, which everybody knew it wouldn't. And then it was sold to another hotel chain. And then behind it, they are building a huge army, a huge naval base. And then behind that, there's another military, there's sort of the outline of another military area. So there is definitely a military area back there with a huge wall and towers, and there's sort of a slip road that they built for fishermen to use. Thank you. The pictures were gorgeous, really gorgeous. Really neat to see sort of everyday things made into art. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Jerzy. That was really, really interesting, and best of luck with the book. So if we go, let's go on to our next speaker. So delighted to introduce Miranda Morris, who everyone I think knows. She's been working on modern South Arabian over the past 30+ years. and is a research fellow at the University of St Andrews. Miranda, I'm going to do your slides for you.
Yes, thank you very much.
I'm going to share screen. If you can just tell me when you want to move on to the next slide.
I will, thank you. And first of all, thank you to Janet for tidying up my PowerPoint, which was extremely amateurish. So could I have the next slide, please? So this is what I started doing. I was interested in poetry from more than 20 years ago, but I started actively working on it then. And the final result is meant to be coming out this year at last. Next slide, please. These are two thoughts on oral poetry, both of which I think are extremely relevant for Soqoṭra. The record of cultural values, identity, and particularly a check on the behaviour and way of conduct. That's very true of the Soqoṭran poetry. And the Ruth Finnegan makes the point that people with few possessions tend to have a rich poetic tradition. Next slide, please. I'm going to start saying something briefly about Soqoṭra poetry. In my work on the island since the late 1980s, I've become increasingly aware that the Soqoṭrans had an extremely rich poetic tradition. Poetry and song were part of everyday life, a natural way of communicating with others, humans, animals, spirits of the dead, sorcerers, demons, and the divine. Most poetic material was sung, the various genres differentiated by tune and refrain. I use the term song or poem here in the sense of a lyric. As I crisscrossed the island with different islanders, camels carrying our water and a sack of rice, when we stopped for the night in a Soqoṭran home, I sat and listened. I tried to write down some of what I heard, which proved extremely difficult, and certainly I couldn't understand any of the poems, even when I had transcribed them. So what makes the material I collected poetry? I consider it to be poetry because those who compose and appreciate it consider it to be such. There's no single term for poetry per se on Soqoṭra. Instead, a variety of terms are used which emphasize other factors. But now that the Arabic term for poetry, she'r, has entered the island vocabulary, this is the term the islanders use to describe their work. I consider it to be poetry because when it's recited or sung, it's organized in stanzas. And I consider it to be poetry because it makes use of language, rhythm, and word order in ways uncommon in everyday speech. I wanted to collect older work rather than poems being composed today. Older poets and islanders whose memories are filled with early material say that modern poems, quote, fill the air with words, quote, unquote. They say they are superficial and lack the deep or layered meaning that true poetry has. They complain that today's poems can easily be understood by anyone, which I can confirm. It's not too hard even for me to understand a lot of poetry that's composed now. A disgruntled old poet said this: "Kun mazadiher wadalaq, Mikhaili wagriha, wadiatrash min todi, inotar wishloba." So anybody can write poetry now. Everybody thinks they're clever, and he is completely contemptuous of modern poetry. Could I have the next slide, please? But poetry continues to be popular on the island, and striking poems in a more complex traditional style are still produced by skilled poets. But the language of today's poetry is strongly influenced by Arabic, and indeed many Soqoṭrans compose entirely in Arabic. Interestingly, Ali Abdullah Rigdi, probably the greatest living poet of Soqoṭra, told me that, quote, adding a scattering of Arabic words to a poem is like adding salt to food. It gives it savor. This is the kind of event that I would sit and listen and try and write down what I heard. Could I have the next slide, please? Of course, many of the pieces we recorded would not be considered by Soqoṭrans to be poems composed by a poet. And we non-Soqoṭrans have to adjust the view most of us have imbibed about poets and poetry. On Soqoṭra, many short poems and songs are composed by ordinary people on impulse with little or no premeditation or rehearsal. Many lullabies, livestock songs, jokes, and work chants fall into this category. It is considered quite normal for Soqotrans of all ages to be perfectly competent at producing such work. What Finnegan writes, unspecialized poets emerge when poetry is diffused widely throughout society, and poetic craft is expected in a measure from everyone. This is her oral poetry book, page 200. It's certainly true of Soqoṭra. However, composing a real poem was another thing entirely. It took skill and required time and deep thought, as well as inspiration. My references to poems in this talk must be understood as encompassing both kinds. To say something about the traditional position of the true poet, the old man on the right of this picture. He, as regards poetry, he must be understood to always include she, because many women are poets. He gained renown by his wit and had this confirmed by hearing his words repeated by others. In the past, and to a certain extent still today, a poet often occupied an ambivalent role on the island. For while he was regarded with respect and admiration, he was also viewed with a certain wariness. Islanders might admire his cleverness and his ability to clarify matters of current importance. They might be moved by the beauty of his words, influenced by his criticism, and recognize his ability to exert pressure on an offender. But there was always the underlying feeling that a poet was basically unpredictable and must be treated with care, because his poems could influence the course of events and affect relationships. And if offended, he could be dangerous. Could I have the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little about challenges. I would like to just give a selection of the challenges I faced in making this collection and some idea of what I did to try and cope with them, my failures and my misjudgments. So of course, first major challenge is always funding. I applied to the British Academy and in 2005 was fortunate to gain support from them. I also applied to the American Institute of Yemeni Studies, AIYS, and they were extremely supportive throughout the whole project. Ethical considerations, another challenge. All those participating as poet or transmitter must be fully aware that their work might appear in the book. We had to be sure they were happy with this before doing any recording. We dealt with this by explaining the project before any recordings were made. If the poet or transmitter was happy with this, he or she recorded their agreement on tape. Challenge of practicality is equipment. You must remember that all this was some time ago. There was very little available on the island before 2000. Certainly no internet such as Janice and I were able to use for the Dauphin Leverhulme-funded language project. What's available on the island today has changed beyond recognition. New shops, new roads, new methods of communication, widespread use of mobile phones, texting, WhatsApp, and so on. But then, any recording equipment we used had to be cheap and simple to use. Tape recorders, batteries, and cassette tapes of adequate quality were simply not available on the island. So I purchased a few of the most basic tape recorders in Britain. Some islanders who were unpracticed in writing or unable to write used to keep in touch with relatives in the Gulf via posted tape cassettes. So this sort of straightforward equipment was understood on the island. Later, I purchased ordinary pocket dictaphones, as these were portable and turned out to be surprisingly robust, though they took longer training to use and had to be modified by covering buttons not to be pressed with sticking plaster. Remember, sadly, of course, the aim was not to collect beautiful recordings, but to record material clearly enough for transcription. As long as TANF and transmitters could understand it, that was enough. I also found I had to bring out regular supplies of good quality tapes and batteries, and later on for the translators, I purchased good quality notebooks and files, even decent working pens and pencils in Sana on my way to the island. Big challenge. Traditional Soqoṭra is un-Islamic. Traditional Soqoṭra poems were disapproved of by many devout Muslims, especially where such material referred to looser relationships between the sexes, or to sorcery and a spirit world that differs from that of the Quran. Also, and importantly, many islanders, even some of the poets, and especially those whose poetry was more influenced by Arabic, had begun to develop ambiguous feelings towards their language. Lacking any written form, it was seen as a sign of backwardness, to symbolize a culture which was embarrassingly primitive. It did little to demonstrate to their mainland neighbors that Soqoṭra was ready and able to play a role in the modern Arab world. As a result of this, many were not keen to be reminded of a past of which they often felt ashamed. This attitude meant that many poets and transmitters of poetry had become increasingly reticent, and this valuable cultural heritage was being eroded even more rapidly than the Soqoṭra language itself. It was lucky that during my time spent on the island since the late 1980s, I had met a number of islanders, including poets and transmitters, people who were aware of the value of the material and what it represented as a storehouse of Soqoṭra language and culture. They asserted that none of it was critical of Islam, and they argued that if anything were to be salvaged, it had to be done soon, as island expertise and traditional ways of life were being forgotten. Without such interest and support, the project would not have been possible. What sort of material should be collected and published? Reactions were mixed. To most, the whole project was seen as unusual, if not downright odd, and many felt it was a waste of time and showed no interest. They had many more urgent priorities, such as feeding a family, finding a job, or getting a training or an education. Some who were interested said they could only support the idea if I collected suitable material, not anything that referred to early belief systems or showed islanders in a backward light. Of course, I couldn't agree to these restrictions for this project. And again, I was lucky enough to be supported by others on the island who, on the contrary, were keen to preserve what remained of their vanishing past, and they did not want a sanitized version. This would not reflect reality. It was people from this group whose encouragement kept me going when the project became ever more complex and drawn out. Some islanders said they were uneasy about the mentioning of specific tribal names and of the possible unpleasantness this might provoke. However, they were mostly assured by others that the mockery of one tribe by another was a universal island phenomenon and had given huge enjoyment and entertainment for generations. They stated publicly that they were perfectly happy that their own tribe be mentioned in any way in poetry. However, we did do our best to ensure that published pieces showed no bias for or against any one grouping, and we decided to leave out or change personal names where this might cause embarrassment. The reactions of living Soqoṭran poets, I knew, were mainly positive. Once convinced that it was in fact possible to write down their work, they were pleased this gave some sort of permanence to their work and might enable it to reach a wider audience. However, the number of pieces in the book composed by living poets is small, and of course we can't guess what the feelings of earlier poets might have been. I then decided to approach two of Soqotra's best-known poets and ask them if they might be willing to compose a poem in Soqotra especially for the book. They agreed to do so, and each produced a composition which they recorded on one of my tape recorders. Incidentally, both chose the same theme, Soqotra in a period of change. As a general observation, I would say it is clearly vital to allow maximum time for discussion, to invite people of all kinds to give their views and then simply listen, listen, and listen. Of course, the listening process couldn't go on forever. Funding was for a limited time. Inevitably, I ended up having to make a number of high-handed and arbitrary decisions and just accept it was never going to be possible to keep everyone happy. But the question of how many should be consulted and how long should be allowed for this process is one that has to be decided by anyone embarking on a similarly sensitive project. Could I have the next slide, please? Second major challenge, finding a partner. I really needed an island partner, a co-author. He or she had to be completely at home in the poetic culture, and preferably from the western half of the island, where traditional poetry and song still flourished. During my time in Soqotra, I had come to know several poets and transmitters. One was Dan of Salim Noh, Dikishin, and that's a picture of him, one of the many with whom I'd worked on a variety of environmental and development projects. In the late 90s and early 2000s, when I began to spend time working with him on my manual of traditional land use to try and understand the system on Western Soqoṭra, we became friends, and I started to appreciate the role poetry played in his family. He himself had a great interest in poetry and a remarkable memory for it. Several members of his extended family were poets and transmitters. His grandmother and grandfather were well known, and his father, who sadly died last year, too. I discussed the project with him and with his family, and Tanif agreed to work with me. He has had no formal education and worked his family's goats, just like the other islanders of the interior. So he was not seen by islanders as a possibly patronizing and arrogant man from the town. So now we approach the American Institute for Yemeni Studies for help, applying to them for a scholarship for Tanif. He was lucky enough to be awarded one. He traveled twice to the UK to work with me on recordings, also funded by ARIS, the American Institute of Yemeni Studies, and on one visit, he gave a well-attended seminar on Soqoṭra poetry in London at the School of Oriental and African Studies. It was Ramadan, and Tanif, of course, was fasting. Nevertheless, he sang and recited poetry for over an hour and still managed to answer the many questions that followed. As another observation, I would say that finding a partner from within the community is the most important challenge to be overcome. I would have given up long ago were it not for Tanif's enthusiasm, his enormous patience, and the friendship and support of his wife and parents. Another challenge, how to collect a fully representative sample of traditional Soqoṭra oral art. During early fieldwork, Soqotrans seemed to completely relax about passing on public pieces. They were less forthcoming with the more private ones. Did they feel that these were too personal for public consumption, or that such homely material, lullabies, butter churning songs, work chants, and livestock songs, were not proper poetry and so not important enough to be included? Interestingly, regarding lullabies, Fahd Salim Kfayen, in his booklet Mukhtarat min Ladab al-Soqoṭri, explains that he gives only 2 or 3 examples of lullabies since intisharu mahdud jiddan, they were rare. He writes that mothers tended to sing like this only when alone with their baby, and he'd been quite unable to collect any examples. However, once we'd spent time explaining that we regard this sort of material as extremely important and valuable and were just as keen to record it, we experienced little difficulty in listing plenty of examples from men and women. Tanif especially was invaluable here. Starting with his own extended family, he then moved in an ever-widening circle around the West, spending time with men and women when they stopped to rest in the shade at midday, or walking along with them as they herded their sheep and goats. He and his family's reputation preceded him. He was not someone to be nervous of. Could I have the next slide, please? I also collected material on a series of field trips in other parts of the island. And 1 or 2 Soqoṭran friends interested in the project borrowed a tape recorder from me and tried to make some recordings in their home area. When I was in my house in Hadibo, poets and transmitters came to spend time there to work more intensely with me. At that time, everybody had to come to Hadibo at some time to go to the market, the various government offices, to settle children with relatives so they could attend school, just to catch up on gossip, and so on. In the end, I more or less had to give up making field trips, as it became increasingly clear that being reliably at home, which was a tent in an enclosed yard with one huge tree, which you can see to the left of the picture, in the old quarter of Hadibo by the old mosque, was really the most productive use of my time. I had 2 long tables, which you can see there, could provide an endless supply of tea, which is my kitchen in the corner there. And it was a quiet and private place where people could discuss things they might well have been more reluctant to do in a more public forum. I should make it clear here that anyone who contributed a recording was paid a modest sum for his or her time and expertise. Most of those who spent long hours with me in my yard in Hadibo could not be persuaded to take the money. Most of those out in the field were glad to do so. Go to the next slide, please. So what pieces to select for publication and what pieces to exclude? These are examples of what we decided to include. But we must remember that, of course, the material was already pre-selected. An oral poem is an ephemeral work of art. If none of those hearing consider it worth remembering, it will disappear and not be heard of again. If the audience is more receptive or appreciative, they might commit the words to memory and then pass them on to others. And it is thanks to all these transmitters of poetry that there is any material to collect. It's not possible to determine the actual age of most pieces, except when they refer to specific persons or events that can be roughly dated. Nor, in many cases, is it possible to determine whether the recorded lines are fragments of originally longer works or complete in themselves. Interesting, what was clear was that some material was regarded as very much older than the rest, and that these pieces from long ago had a greater moral authority, and their words had greater significance for most islanders. So for publication, we decided to include a selection of what you see in this slide. We also agreed what to exclude. Although we were given a lot of material composed in a mixture of Arabic and Soqoṭra, we decided to concentrate on material composed primarily in Soqoṭra. This early material was in danger of disappearing completely, as were those who could understand and interpret it. We decided to leave out the very popular form called qasida or danadon, sung by men at celebrations and festivities all over the island. These pieces are similar in language and style to those sung throughout the Arabian Peninsula. They continue to be popular on Soqoṭra and seem to be at no risk of disappearing. We decided to omit examples of the Mawlid, where religious verses are chanted in Arabic, accompanied by the Soqoṭra tambourine drums. Particularly popular in the eastern and central parts of the island, this ceremony was not in celebration of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, the Mawlid al-Nabi, or of a saint, as elsewhere in the Islamic world, but was a performance carried out at parties and celebrations by an invited and paid troupe of players. They were especially in demand for the processions accompanying the bridegroom to his bride. And finally, we also agreed to ignore the more obscene pieces in our collection. They're of a puerile type, familiar everywhere, and more important, their inclusion could well have been gratuitously offensive to the islands. Could I have the next slide, please? Third major challenge, how the project changed over time. Plan A, the original, had simply for me to collect some poems, transcribe them phonetically, and translate them into English. It soon became clear from talking with Soqoṭra that they wanted more. They had long felt themselves ignored by the world and cut off from it. They believed that their Arab neighbours knew little about them. If Soqoṭra were known at all in the Arab world, it was as a place of witchcraft, bizarre customs, and an unintelligible language. And indeed, I myself encountered much of this attitude during my years in Dhofar. So they wanted other Arabs to appreciate that Soqoṭra was a place with its own culture, reflected in its poetry. So we then had Plan B, transcribing phonetically, translating to English and into Arabic. However, those working with us, 22 translators, men and women, as well as others who came to see me, made it clear that they felt strongly that the Soqoṭra material too should appear in Arabic script. Only this would allow their children and their children's children to discover something of their poetic inheritance. Indeed, they decided all the material should be in Arabic as well as in English. I was daunted, but I agreed and decided that as much as possible the work should be carried out by the islanders themselves so that the book would be theirs too. This meant that we now had Plan C, poems phonetically and in Arabic script, translated into English and into Arabic, and make the book effectively trilingual, Soqoṭra, English and Arabic. And this, of course, meant seeking further funding. Taking on board this request from the islanders resulted in a much longer and more complex work and greatly extended the timescale of the project. Could I have the next slide, please? So we have to find these translators. Tanuf, my partner, is functionally illiterate, and even if that had not been the case, he would never have been able to translate some 1,500 poems by himself. We agreed that any translator had, of course, to be literate, but also that both sexes must be represented and as many different regions of the island as possible with their differing dialects. A number of men and women known personally or by reputation to myself or Tanif asked whether they might be interested in trying to do the work. And when our request became known, others approached and offered their services. Each applicant was given 1 or 2 short pieces to transcribe and translate. Some then decided it was too hard and they withdrew. We explained to those who remained and to new people taken on later that 1, they'd be formally paid for their work and would sign invoices for it. 2, they were free to add any footnotes to their translation they felt necessary or useful. 3, that if their work appeared in a book, it would appear under their name alone. Some chose to make no notes. Some made notes on certain lexical items. A few made extensive notes, and especially one very devout woman who appended each translation with a long 2 or 3 pages disquisition on the way Islam had changed things for the better. How to organize the work of more than 20 translators and transcribers? The method we adopted was to share out the selected material between them, 1 by 1. Later, when we established partnerships 2 by 2, they came to my yard in Hadibo and listened as Tanif recited the piece in Soqoṭra. This they wrote down in whatever Arabic characters they felt would help them record it. There was time for questions and discussion about the piece. Then the translator took the material back home to work in it. They came back with their Arabic versions and recorded both the original and the Arabic translation to tape. As a subsidiary challenge, we had the problem of timekeeping. Clearly, my time in Soqoṭra was limited, so I had to be extremely strict about timekeeping and boringly British. We had a shaky start until those who were poor timekeepers realized that they simply missed their slot if they turned up in the middle of someone else's. In the end, it all worked out surprisingly well. This next challenge was a big one that many of the younger Soqotrans simply didn't understand, the traditional poetry. So quickly was the Soqotra poetic lexicon becoming obsolete that many of them didn't understand what they were hearing. I had failed to appreciate quite how quickly the language, allusions, and cultural references had become opaque to the present school-educated generation. It seemed that only the older members of the community were able to interpret the many layers of meaning which are a striking feature of this poetry. But it also became apparent that there was some awkwardness on the part of translators to admit to the difficulties they were encountering, and a certain reluctance to seek help from older members of the community who had not had their educational advantages. We found that the most successful system was to pair the formally educated translator with an older, non-formally educated partner, someone still at home in the Soqotra poetic idiom and considerably older. This seemed to work well, and a lot of pieces were translated by 2 people working together. Many translators had, of course, underestimated quite how hard it is to translate from one language to another, and especially poetry. I found this just as hard as my colleagues. Translation is a very imperfect science, and the frustrations are enormous. How to try and convey to a non-Soqotra audience the subtextual references of Soqotra culture. My decision was to try and produce a straightforward, rather literal translation of the original that could be easily read and understood by a general reader. More detailed explanatory material was left for the notes at the foot of the poem or for the very extensive thematic glossaries section. I made no attempt to match the rhythm of the Soqotra or to produce a poetic version, skills which I absolutely don't possess. Could I have the next slide, please? The 4th major challenge was something else I had failed to understand, was the different levels of fluency in Arabic. It hadn't been difficult to find people prepared to try translating Soqotra into Arabic, but it soon became apparent that the quality of the written Arabic varied markedly. It's a second language for all of them. And what Arabic they have, they've learned under different educational systems and to different standards. Until recent times, opportunities for education on Soqotra have always been limited and unevenly available. At that time, reading material was not readily available outside Hadibo, even newspapers. Few listened regularly to the radio, and television was only sporadically accessible in the two major towns of Hadibo and Palencia, where there was relatively reliable electricity. The majority of the translators indeed had not attended secondary school. Until 2008, there was only one secondary school, which was in Hadibo. With a single exception, none of them had previous experience of using Arabic in this way. They lacked fluency, and they struggled to translate the extensive and nuanced vocabulary of the original Soqoṭra. Some took refuge in a literal word-for-word translation, making the Arabic version meaningless or incomprehensible. Many needed a lot of help and encouragement, and a few gave up altogether. Fifth major challenge, of course, what system should be used to transcribe the Soqoṭra in Arabic script? There was no agreed system for transcribing Soqoṭra in this way, though many different systems were used on Soqoṭra or by Soqotran emigres in the Gulf. Clearly, there was no time for us to try and establish a system to which all would subscribe, nor indeed was it appropriate that such a vital task be attempted by our small group. It was therefore decided that each translator would use whatever system he or she preferred. As each poem appeared with the name of its Soqoṭra translator and transcribed beneath, it would be clear that the transcription system represented an individual preference only. As an interesting observation, it was clear that the translators and transcribers adapted whatever they heard from Tanuf speaking in his dialect to their own dialect. I.e., if they were not from the West themselves, they ignored his kh and gh sounds and replaced them with ha and ain throughout. There'd been no previous discussion about this. There was a great variation among translators in the Arabic characters they used to transcribe sounds such as d and ta, s, za, and z, and all the sh, ch series. There seemed no agreed system. Could I have the next slide, please? Once we had a body of material recorded, we paused while I had a good look at it at home. After discarding the material discussed above, I made an initial selection of representative pieces. As expected, this sometimes proved problematical. We had alternative versions of the same piece. Some pieces were partial representations of a longer piece recorded elsewhere. What to choose? Many variants existed both within a specific locality and in different areas of the island. The differences varied from minor changes, as mentioned, replacing the dialect of the original with the speaker's own dialect, to significant changes in vocabulary, length and line order, to the complete transposition or omission of couplets and quatrains, the basic building block of a Soqoṭra poem. The places and geographical features mentioned differed in different versions, i.e., the poem had been cleverly adapted for the home audience. Inevitably, the selection of a version to publish was rather arbitrary and based on our personal preference. This means that some of the published material represents only one version of a poem or song. Some genres were overrepresented, such as the popular Qasaid Danadon, and some were underrepresented, for example, certain domestic songs. It was clear there were gaps in the material which it would be good to fill. So further, more focused field trips were made by Tanuf. A few other friends took one of my tape recorders to try and fill some gaps, while I remained in Hadibo doing much the same with my stream of visitors. Could I have the next slide, please? Once the selection material had been transcribed and translated into Arabic, we paused again. Going through the material in detail, it became clear that some of the translations were simply not acceptable and would have to be retranslated. This was solved on my next trip to Soqoṭra by giving the unsatisfactorily translated pieces to the better of the translators to be retranslated. But it also made it clear that we needed an Arab editor. We couldn't, in fairness, leave the Arabic of some of the translations as it stood. This might be damaging to the Soqotrans' stated desire to have their culture recognized by their mainland neighbors and to appear as modern Arabs. We were going to need help in correcting the Arabic. We needed somebody with a Soqotra background and somebody particularly would appreciate the delicacy of the task. We were lucky enough to obtain the help of the daughter of my first Soqoṭra teacher and older Soqoṭri friend, the late Ahmed Saad Tahki, then living in Dhofar. His daughter Asma was a university graduate of Arabic language and literature and taught Arabic language at sixth form level in Oman. The house was full of things Soqoṭran. Ahmed was passionate about the island and its language, and it was to his endlessly hospitable home that Soqoṭrans from all over Oman, as well as visitors from the Gulf, always used to congregate. Asma generously agreed to act as our Arabic editor, and in the spring of 2008, she traveled to Britain with her father to work on correcting basic grammatical and spelling errors. We agreed that she should not try to retranslate any material, nor would we alter any translation to make it more literary. All local colloquialisms were left unchanged. So in essence, I believe each translation remains the work of the named translator, which leads to the next challenge: how to allow the translators to check their work before publication. It was agreed with the translators that for my next field trip, their material would be printed out, bound, and brought back to Soqoṭra for them to check. This was done, and as soon as I arrived, we got in touch with each translator to tell him that his or her work was now available. A month was allowed for the process, and Tanif was on hand daily to offer any help required in understanding the poems. 3 of the translators were not able to proofread their work. Very sadly, one woman had recently died in hospital on the mainland. More happily, another had left the island to get married in the Gulf, and a very good man translator was off the island throughout the period and beyond, caring for a sick relative. Of the remaining ones, surprisingly few chose to take advantage of this opportunity. Even when reminded, they didn't come to collect their work to review it. They gave no reason for this, and given their initial enthusiasm for the project, we were puzzled by their lack of interest at this stage. Were they bored with the project? Already perfectly satisfied with their work? Did they trust me to transfer their handwritten material to disk accurately? Or did they not understand the very concept of proofreading? Tanif was very cynical. He said it was because they weren't paid for proofreading. Whatever the reason, we both found it disappointing. The rest did read through their work, some perfunctorily, some with great care, making many changes and corrections. Only the 2 university students seemed to understand the real purpose of the exercise. Indeed, looking back, I could see that they had been the most enthusiastic when the plans for proofreading had been discussed. Under Plan C, the next challenge, it had always been planned that the introductory chapters should be translated into Arabic by a professional translator. However, for the rest, it was decided that the front matter, thematic glossaries, which are very extensive, and the material linking section of the book should also be professionally translated. This is not to say, of course, that there was no one on Soqoṭra capable of such work, but questions of timeliness, and especially the sheer unreliability of communication with the island at that time, meant that I decided it would be more efficient to work with a professional translator. We were fortunate to gain the experience of Issam ad-Din Awad from the Sudan, who knows Yemen well and is an extremely experienced translator. Also, he'd worked with them before on Soqoṭri material as a translator for the newsletter of the Friends of Soqoṭra, as well as translating the book Soqoṭra Heritage and Future, which was distributed to households on Soqoṭra. Issam was based either in the Sudan, where his daughter at university, or in Saudi, where his wife works as a doctor. He was a delight to work with. We had to rewrite a preface for the book because it was so late from 2012 to now 2021. And I would like to very much acknowledge the help of Orhan Elmaz, who helped in retranslating this new material. A final challenge to discuss here, how to make it possible for interested people to actually hear some of the recorded material. With more funding, I was able to select a representative sample, some 150 pieces of the better recordings. remember how very primitive the recording apparatus was and in extremely unideal field conditions. I was able to have these professionally processed to 2 CDs or 2 cassette tapes. The cassette tapes dated from the time when the Social Fund for Development, Yemen, had been planning to fund an inexpensive Arabic-only version of the book in-house in Yemen. Sadly, the war put paid to that plan. The original idea was that the 2 CDs or cassettes and their transcription and English translation would accompany the book. Instead, now, they're to be made available online for free by Brill. So I have cartons of CDs and cassettes in my cellar. If anyone wants a set, they can get in touch with me. I have, of course, given lots of copies to Tanuf, though I know they have a short life, playing in the listeners' trucks and pickups as they bump and jolt over the uneven ground on the island. Could I have the last slide, please? To conclude, by the end, we had recorded over 100 Soqotran poets and transmitters. 82 of them agreed to be named in the published acknowledgements. Others did not want their names mentioned. And when some women decided they only wanted to be named as Fulan, mother of so-and-so, others who had previously wanted to be formally acknowledged changed their minds, and all the women contributors became Fulan. I'm very pleased to report that gratifyingly, our project does seem to have played a part in renewing enthusiasm on the island for poetry. There's a poets club, officially sponsored poetry events and competitions. Those we learned in our last Soqoṭra session from Julian. Some sponsor poetry in Arabic only. And Soqoṭra poetry can be found all over social media and YouTube. Systems for transcribing Soqoṭra using Arabic characters are under discussion, and the Russian team with their Soqoṭra colleagues have devised one that has already appeared in their marvelous Corpus of Soqoṭran Oral Literature, Volumes 1 and 2. Excitingly, an increasing number of Soqoṭran students are beginning to study their own language at an advanced level. All this is very encouraging and suggests there might be a future for poetry on Soqoṭra, though I do suspect it will be increasingly composed and written in Arabic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Miranda. That was absolutely extraordinary. One thing I would like to ask is, you listed all the challenges, and these challenges came up sequentially. They weren't challenges that you saw from the beginning.
No.
And I for one am very glad you didn't find out about them when you first started, because
I wouldn't have
I'm not sure whether you would have done it.
I wouldn't have done it, no.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's not that it's taken from 2000 to 2021 to do it. I've been doing other things too, as you know, but really it became a nightmare. And I was very glad of the Leave a Hume project. I just didn't look at it for 8 years, and I was delighted not to. Yeah.
Yes.
No, the reason for presenting the talk in this way is in the hopes that others won't be so idiotic and will think before they start, and not in the middle as they're keeping going.
But I think whatever project we're involved with, you're bound to constantly be reflecting on what you've done and changes that need to be made, irrespective of what the project is. And I think that that's just part of research, and particularly with a project of this magnitude.
Yes, it did grow and grow.
Yeah. One of the things that I found interesting was that you had 2 poets who wrote poems specifically for the volume, and that both chose the same theme, presumably independently: Soqoṭra in a period of change.
Yes, and rather sadly, I have recorded an awful lot of poems about Soqoṭra in change, and they're all negative, because the poets writing mostly in Soqoṭra tend to be older, and they don't like the changes they're seeing, as it is normal everywhere across the world. So they're very depressing poems. Yes, they're part of a genre which I suspect is probably continuing today, though I'm rather out of date with modern Soqoṭra poetry at the moment.
Yes, yeah. I also really appreciated what you were talking about when you talked about ethics, and it wasn't just for the ethics challenge. It was actually something that went throughout your talk. the importance of involving people, the importance of naming.
Yeah,
people,
I really want them to have some ownership of the book. And obviously, it's rather like I get very neurotic about taking photographs. I hate people who sneak photographs. And I think sneaking words is just as bad.
Yes.
So we had to be very clear. And I was impressed that although we had people who said, you must never use my name and you mustn't say that I worked with you, the majority, men and women, were prepared to say, my name is so-and-so. I understand that my work might appear in publication. I agree to it. You know, it was very good. And we kept these tapes for years after we'd finished working with them. I've binned them now because really there's a limit to what you can keep.
Yes.
But I was glad we did it. And I think it sort of set a standard, which I think is a desirable standard to set.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. In fact, I'll throw the floor open now for questions. Julian.
Yeah, so not a question, more comment. I think I can agree with Miranda that the general gist now with poetry in the island tends to be more of a, in the past things were good and things are changing a lot and this change isn't for the best. And there's a lot of that going on. Like you say, mostly the elderly, but also you sing with sort of some of the younger poets. And sadly, a lot of the poetry as well is incorporating a lot more Arabic into the poetry at the moment. And there's these little small poetry gatherings where you used to get these little sponsored gatherings. You used to have the women groups and the men groups all sitting around the same thing. And I think some of that's eroding away now as well. You're not getting that as much, and it's becoming, we'd have to travel to an hour outside Heidelberg to a special location only known to a select few, and then that's where the poets would meet, just so that they didn't have to deal with the extra bit of having women there. And even when there were women poets talking, often you would have a guy say something and it would get all a bit heated, and then the guy would say "Khalas," and we'd go. It would all just end and we'd all leave. So yeah, there's a lot of change, but it's there's still a very big influence, and I see it more in Kalansir, where the governor is very much more involved, and there's this whole sort of almost, I would say, a cultural revival going on at the moment. Which is good.
I'm very glad to hear it. I mean, the missing of joining the sexes. In my experience, the only time I had these really happy experiences when in the more remote places where 4 or 5 families would gather and we'd all sit around in a big circle and they played poetry games. That I recite a line, you recite a line, she recites a line, round and round. And if you can't remember one, then you're given a nasty task to do, like you've got to muck out the sheep bar or you've got to fetch something and feed everybody. But I mean, there were games and it was fun. And obviously having both sex and children all joining in it, it's a lovely learning experience. And I really regret the fact that this is frowned on as being non-Islamic. And I'm glad to see some fight back, a revival, particularly among a group I know well in the Central Mountains, who are saying, look, God gave us the skills to write poetry. He can't think it's wrong. We're going to go on singing it. And so we'll see what happens. Yeah, it is sad.
Yeah, well, the good thing is with these, hopefully we can keep the festival thing going, but the festivals have been a real eye-opener, and it's so surprisingly well attended. And a lot of the younger Soqoṭras, really their Soqoṭra is very, very poor, if at all. And we found this quite often when trying to translate things for Oliver. They say they do, but when you start listening to people and they go, I have no idea what you just said. But when you actually have the festivals themselves, it's packed. It's absolutely solidly packed. And they may not understand the poetry, but they're really involved and they're all shouting and, repeating that line straight after the poet. Like,
it's lovely, isn't it? Yes.
Thank you very much, Julian. Further questions?
Can I ask?
Yes, please do. Yeah. Said.
شكرا ميرندا على البرزنتيشن الجميل هذا الصراحة، ونشكر جهودك طبعا. بس أنا عندي سؤال، ممكن أتكلم عربي لا ولا لازم إنجليزي؟
لا ليش بالعربي.
إذن أنا عندي سؤال أو استفسار، ما أعرف هل هو متعلق بالبرزنتيشن هذا أو ممكن يكون خارج نوعا ما. الحين سقطرى والتراديشنال والثقافات بيئة الحياة واللغة هناك فيها تشابه كثير للبيئة اللي موجودة في محافظة ظفار. ولكن هذه الجزيرة أقرب لليمن، يعني هي أقرب لليمن، يفترض أنها تتأثر بشكل كبير باليمنيين وبحياة اليمنيين واللغة اليمنيين اللي هي اللغات اللي كانوا يتكلموها. ولكن هذه الجزيرة متأثرة جدا بمحافظة ظفار واللغات الموجودة في محافظة ظفار، حتى طريقة الأغاني وطريقة بعض الأشياء كثير فيها متشابهة. أنا سؤالي هنا، ليش هذه الجزيرة تأثرت بمحافظة ظفار أكثر من أنها تتأثر باليمن نفسها؟
I wish I knew the answer, Saeed. The common reason often given by some islanders is that since the Mahra came and ruled it from the 1600s, they brought a certain amount of Dhofari influence with them. Also, a number of the Shahar left Dhofar and came to the island, where they're also called Tharo, and were, rather than being the poorest of the poor, became the right hand of the Mahra sultans. But I think my own feeling, which is I have no reliable evidence to back it up, is that that group of population was one population at one stage. It extended across southern Arabia and possibly into parts of Tigrinya highlanders. And it is actually one group, because there's similarities there too. And I hope that those who know, obviously much more than me, might tease this out, because it's one of the things that made me very happy in Soqoṭra, there's similarities to what I found in Dhofar. Although it is worth pointing out that the actual, the songs, the tunes, the refrains, the types of song are quite different. They're not anything like, there's no nana, there's no ried, nothing similar to that. And nor is there the mixing of languages you get in Dhofari poetry, which makes it so complex. But other things, I quite agree with you. I mean, you could go to Soqoṭra tomorrow, Saeed, and you would really feel at home. I hope you go one day.
أتمنى أزور سقطرى صراحة يعني. I wish to visit Soqoṭra, and I need to make a short film from Soqoṭra, documentary film.
Yes, good.
I wish to go, but you know.
You would work with Tanuf. You would work with Tanuf and make a very nice film. He's a lovely man.
I'm ready to do everything for Soqoṭra. I wish to see Soqoṭra first. My friend, they visit Soqoṭra before I think 1 year before the pandemic, and they make a film. They dive even in the ocean and they make a film. It's a good film, but it's still not published yet.
Yeah.
So I asked them to join to ask me to bring me to the Soqoṭra, but they say there's problem now because of the politic things, you know, what's happened in Yemen. But one day, who knows? One day. Thank you, man.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Nice to see you.
Thank you. Nice to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Saeed. Are there any further questions for the moment? I liked what you said about poets being viewed with ambivalence, and I expect this is something that we would probably find globally among local cultures, where the poet is viewed with ambivalence because they can produce poetry private poetry, but their poetry can also influence.
Yes, they're suspiciously clever. They're too clever.
And they are suspiciously clever, absolutely. Yeah.
And there's a great belief that a lot of their poems foretell the future. So you really want a poet to say something nice about you.
Yeah.
I had some poems written about me, and one of them was not very nice, and it was quite upsetting. The others were just standard flattery, but I was more interested in that one.
Yeah, absolutely.
I always find the poetry quite strange because, I don't know, in the West potentially we see poetry as somebody nice standing there saying nice things about somebody else, whereas the reality here is some people have been banned from poetry competitions because of what they wanted to say. One will allow you to say and do not say another one. And I was just like, what? And they really quite nasty, actually, some of these poems. It's just like, oh, okay. But yeah, we had a few of those during the selection of the poets and the poems for the poetry competitions. It's quite.
No, they're really offensive. There's a poem saying, "Wait till tribe X comes down, then there'll be fleas everywhere." they're not nice. And I can genuinely understand why an island that's riven by tribal infighting was not enthusiastic about having tribal names mentioned. And if it hadn't been for those who said, look, you can mention my tribe, and then you can mention mine. In the end, we mentioned a lot. We have a whole section on the book called Tribes.
Yeah.
And everybody just accepted. And Tarnov said, you can say everybody hates the Kishan, his tribe, because they're very good thieves, and they're very martial and very numerous, and I suspect rather bullying. And he said, you can say anything you want about the Kishan. I don't mind what it is. Although he did make sure that one nice one slipped in too. No, well, it was tricky because you don't want to upset people. On the other hand, I feel that future generations might like to have these things recorded. It is their past. So it's a tricky line to go between trying not to be offensive and colonialist, and yet trying to get a job done. So I think it's not straightforward.
Absolutely. And it's a part of oral history.
Yes, I think so. And some of them are dated. Their first plane that was heard, there's a lovely poem about that. And the first time they saw a woman with her head uncovered, I mean, they notice things. It's a newspaper, isn't it? Better newspaper.
Exactly. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick
Alan.
Quick question? Hi, Miranda.
Alan.
There's a lot of talk about the loss of poetry traditions and language in general on Soqoṭra. As you know, I have a bit of an opinion, as do others, that when we've tried to conserve other aspects of Soqoṭra heritage, particularly natural heritage, we've tended to impose external ideas and ways of doing that, which haven't always been successful. Is there another way for language, rather than bringing first world constructs and trying to force people to conserve things in ways that kind of fit into our nice global conventions, or is there a local way to do that, or are we past that stage?
I think the only way that has worked in other areas I know is if the people who are speaking the language want to conserve it. That's the first thing. And that now does appear in sections of the Soqoṭran population. But the second thing is schools. And you may remember that a long time ago with Sue Christie and Roderick Dutton, the Soqoṭra was to be introduced to the school curriculum. And that was over 15 years ago. And it just fell down because the Yemeni ministries couldn't decide whether it would come under education or culture. They argued and barged backward and forth. And the whole thing collapsed, although the lessons were prepared and were excellent. I mean, Richard Porter's involved doing lovely bird identification things. And it was all done in Soqoṭra, transcribed in Arabic. And I can't see any other way other than starting at school. But you need, and then it was interesting talking at the last FOS meeting with two ministers, of Yemeni ministers there, particularly the Minister of Tourism and his wife, who were very keen to support Soqoṭra and to support its introduction to school curriculum. But poor Yemen, I mean, they were really keen and they were active and prepared to do something. Fahed, who's one of the transmitters, he's now a minister himself. You would think there would be some chance, but obviously they too have got other things in their mind, and time passes very, very quickly for the death of a language. It can disappear, as Julian was saying already. You have young people who don't understand Soqoṭran.
Yeah, absolutely.
So no, I think there isn't a way that I know other than that people themselves want to conserve it and you start in schools. That's the only way it's worked in parts of Wales, but even Gaelic in Scotland. Some Australian languages have been preserved by being used in schools and supported by those at home. But there's a time gap. If you wait until the parents and grandparents don't know it, it's in my view, too late already. But that's rather a pessimistic outlook.
Thank you.
Omar, I think you've got a question. I think we'll take this as the last question. Omar Al-Kindi?
He's muted.
Yeah. Unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hi, Miranda. Hi, everyone. Can you hear my voice now?
Yes.
Yeah. So Soqoṭra has such a special presence in Oman, northern Omani culture, especially in Wadi Bani Kharous. In Wadi Bani Kharous, there is a place name is called Zahir Soqoṭra. So it's like a very special place, and people refer it to the expedition, the Imam Salat al-Kharousi expedition to Soqoṭra, to free it from so-called Christians. And it seems like this incident is very celebrated in Omani history, like classical Omani history, especially with the modern and also past historians. It seems like did you notice any presence of or any awareness about such I would say events in Soqoṭra oral tradition? Yeah, did you?
They call it Zahra's poem. The poem is even if people don't know it and can't speak it, because it's quite difficult Arabic, as I'm sure you'd agree, they know all about it. And as you know, Soqoṭra, as Saeed was saying, it's part of Yemen. Of course it's part of Yemen, but it's geographically, it's located in the sea almost directly opposite Salalah. And of course, many islanders say, we wish we were under Oman. I mean, they don't care who they're under. They just want to be under somebody who allows them to breathe, as they say. Khalin and Nissam. But yes, the story is known, and the friendship, the old friendship with Oman is recognized. There's no doubt. I didn't know about this that you're talking about. I find that about the Soqoṭra. I think that's very interesting. I'd like to see it.
Yeah.
The name is known. The Kharousi name is known, and the Oman's protecting them from Christian brutality. They get mixed up with the period, but basically they understand it as Portuguese brutality, which was obviously genuine, but they associate that was a takeover of Soqoṭra, and that's what the Omanis rescued them from. I say they've concertinaed various events into one event, but they're very aware of it.
The Arabic time, like the time that's the modern age time, but not the Imamate, like the first Imamate. This was my particular question. Is about this specific event. Sorry to interrupt you. I'm really sorry.
No, that's quite right. No, I don't think there's not a general awareness. I'm sure there is among educated Soqotris. The general awareness is just as the poem of Zahra, which is asking the Omanis to come to her help. That's what they're aware of. Which imamate and who was the imam is not something that they concern themselves with, in my experience.
Great, thank you very much, Omar. And thank you very much, Miranda. That was absolutely fascinating and beautifully delivered, as always.
Pleasure.
The next workshop will involve Leonid Kogan, who's going to be talking about recent lexicographic research on Soqoṭra with an emphasis on the comparative historical dimension. That's on the 4th of May, and we'll be sending the Zoom link for that in the next few days. Jerzy also wanted to mention something which relating to your book.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. You know, I don't know if I clearly expressed my willingness to cooperate with someone who would like to write some text for my book about this abandoned places in Oman. As, for example, Kamala mentioned before, you know, my knowledge about the context of living of these places is of course limited, and I don't want to publish any expressions without any confirmation from the science or from the I don't know, local community. There is too much artistic publications with only, you know, subjective feelings of the artist without any you know, serious text or serious knowledge. So if anyone would like to add something or inspired me to write something or have any information about these places, information maybe directly from the community or directly from the government, or as Kamala mentioned, maybe there is some laws who is owned these places, why these people left without any care about these heritage places. Please contact or please share or please write something, but because, you know, I don't want to publish only another photo book or another artistic publications. I would like to, let me say, add something for the next Oman lovers or scientists to get some serious knowledge about the context of the situation I photographed. That's from me. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Jerzy, perhaps you could send your send an email to Kamala, and then Kamala send your email address to the distribution list.
Yeah,
it may be helpful also if you put it in the chat right now, because I think there's probably several people here who might be interested in that.
I think anyone can contact with me by my website is www.jerzywerzbicki.com. Oh, I'm not sure I write to everybody. I write to oh, maybe like this. Sorry. Okay.
Great.
Yeah, please contact anyone, whatever you can give me or can write or can tell me about my photographs, maybe some objects, maybe some paints, maybe some, I don't know, whatever, what can, you know, enrich my knowledge about my own projects. I will be very happy and I will be very grateful. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'll save the chat and I will share that with the WhatsApp group, and it can be shared with the distribution list as well. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you particularly to Jerzy and Miranda, and hope to see you on the 4th of May. Thanks very much. Bye.
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 Thanks. Everyone.